Admiral Threx stood at the edge of the observation deck aboard the Unity Horizon orbital station. Towering above Earth, the star-filled expanse framed his imposing figure as his four eyes scanned the blue-green planet below. He was a member of the Vorthquar Armada, a race known across the galaxy for their unyielding discipline and tactical prowess. His scaled skin shimmered faintly under the station's artificial lights, and his rigid posture conveyed both pride and impatience. Beside him, Captain Mark Ellison attempted to explain the intricacies of humanity's recent technological advancements. The human spoke with enthusiasm, describing breakthroughs in Starship propulsion energy systems and interstellar diplomacy, yet Threx's mind wandered. His centuries of experience as a strategist made him skeptical of humanity's capabilities. Their rapid expansion into space reeked of desperation and recklessness rather than ingenuity. Captain Ellison gestured toward the wide corridor ahead. "It's this way, Admiral," he said. "We've set up a cultural exchange showcase that I think you'll find enlightening." With a subtle hiss of annoyance, Threx followed the human through the bustling station. The Unity Horizon was a hive of activity. Human engineers darted past carrying tools, and datapads. Children laughed as they ran through the halls, chased by adults in uniform. Merchants called out from kiosks offering alien and human goods alike. To Threx, it all seemed chaotic, unrefined. Ellison led him to a large open room where a crowd of humans, young and old, gathered around various interactive displays. The Admiral noticed holograms of Starship's intricate engineering models, and even a corner devoted to music and art. His gaze landed on a small group near the back, where loud cheers erupted. Curious despite himself, Threx approached the commotion. At the center of the group was a young human child sitting in a chair surrounded by an array of screens and controls. The girl was issuing rapid commands, her small hands flying over the console. Her expression was focused and intense, yet there was an undeniable spark of enjoyment in her eyes. "This is Lily Harrison," Ellison explained with a smile. "She's one of the best players of Stellar Fleet Academy, a popular simulator game among kids here." "A game?" Threx asked, his tone laced with disdain. "You expect me to believe this child is accomplishing anything of value playing with toys?" Ellison's grin widened. "Oh, it's not just any game, Admiral. Watch and see." Threx narrowed his eyes, but stayed silent, observing the girl as she navigated the simulation. The screens displayed a starfield filled with ships, some marked as allies, others as enemies. The child's simulated fleet was vastly outnumbered, surrounded by enemy vessels that moved with precision and coordination. Yet to Threx's astonishment, the girl responded with an almost instinctive brilliance. She divided her forces, creating diversions and exploiting gaps in the enemy formation. Her flagship darted through the chaos, taking out critical targets before vanishing into a field of asteroids. The enemy fleet began to crumble under the pressure. The crowd erupted in cheers as the simulation ended in victory for Lily. Threx found himself stepping closer, studying the displays more intently than he cared to admit. "Impressive, isn't it?" Ellison asked, his tone teasing. Threx did not reply. Instead, he stared at the child, her hands now resting casually on the controls. She turned to face him, her youthful grin disarming yet confident. "What's the matter, Mr. Alien?" she asked. "Play much?" Threx's expression darkened as a flicker of intrigue crossed his mind. Lily Harrison sat up straighter in her chair as Admiral Threx continued to study her. His towering frame cast a shadow over the simulator console, but the girl seemed unfazed. Her wide grin stayed firmly in place while she leaned back confidently, one hand resting on the joystick. "What's the matter, Mr. Alien?" she said again, her tone light and teasing. "Can't figure out how it works." Threx's four eyes narrowed as he straightened to his full height, towering over her, and the crowd gathered behind. He was unaccustomed to being addressed so casually, especially by a child. Captain Ellison hid a smirk behind his hand, gesturing for the Admiral to respond. Threx, however, merely crossed his arms over his chest and regarded the child with a mixture of disdain and intrigue. "Explain this game to me," he finally said, his voice cold and deliberate. Lily shrugged, brushing her messy blonde hair out of her face. "It's simple, really," she said. "All you have to do is protect your fleet, outmaneuver the enemy, and complete your mission objectives without losing too many ships. Easy." Simple Threx repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. He glanced at the screens, which still displayed the chaotic aftermath of her battle. The simulation had ended with her fleet victorious, but at a steep cost. Nearly half her ships were destroyed, and her flagship had barely survived. The reckless nature of her strategies grated against his instincts. Yes, Simple Lily replied with a playful tilt of her head. Though I guess if you're new it might take a little practice. She leaned forward in her seat, her fingers dancing over the controls. Want me to show you a few moves? Threx's scales shimmered faintly as he suppressed a retort. Instead, he turned to Ellison, who stood nearby grinning like he was watching a comedy routine. The Admiral spoke without looking back at the child. This is the level of strategic thinking you value, Captain, he asked, his tone cutting. You allow your young to play at war without understanding its consequences. Ellison didn't flinch at the remark. Actually, Admiral, we don't see it as play at all. He gestured toward the simulator's intricate setup. Stellar Fleet Academy is more than a game. It's a training tool disguised as entertainment. Its algorithms adapt to the player's decisions, creating scenarios that push their tactical and strategic limits. Threx's gaze flicked back to the child. You're telling me this human has been trained to command through this simulation? Lily snorted. Not trained exactly. I mean, I play it for fun. Her voice carried an air of nonchalance, but her actions told a different story. She reset the simulator and began setting up a new scenario, picking enemy forces that far outmatched her own fleet. The room grew quieter as the crowd leaned in, watching her with admiration and anticipation. Threx found himself unable to look away as Lily launched into the new scenario. Her fleet warped into the simulated starfield and immediately faced overwhelming odds. Enemy ships flanked her on all sides, pressing her into a tight formation. Lily didn't panic. Instead, she began issuing commands faster than before, splitting her fleet into smaller units and baiting the enemy forces into pursuing decoys. Threx noted her precision, her ability to adapt quickly to changes in the simulation, and the way she seemed to anticipate the enemy's movements before they happened. After only a few minutes, her fleet pulled off an improbable victory, leaving the simulated starfield littered with the debris of enemy ships. The crowd erupted into cheers once more, but Threx stayed silent. His mind was racing with questions. The child's abilities were far beyond what he would have expected, even for a species as erratic and unpredictable as humans. Lily turned back toward him, her grin widening as she saw the look on his face. So how'd I do? She asked. Threx narrowed his eyes again. This human child had just demonstrated a grasp of tactics that rivaled some of his best officers, and yet she treated it as nothing more than a game. Intrigue turned into something deeper as he realized there was much more to humanity than he had anticipated. The room was alive with chatter and laughter as the other children gathered around Lily, congratulating her on yet another victory. Admiral Threx, however, remained still, his towering frame an immovable presence among the chaos. His 4 eyes darted between the simulation's debrief screens, studying the details of Lily's improbable win. This is absurd, he finally said, more to himself than anyone else. Captain Ellison leaned casually against a nearby console, his arms crossed, and a knowing smile on his face. Not absurd, Admiral, just unconventional. He gestured toward Lily, who was now resetting the simulator for another round. Humans thrive on thinking outside the box. Threx turned sharply to face Ellison. Outside the box, he repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. You call reckless improvisation a virtue? Ellison didn't flinch. Reckless improvisation is just another way to say creative problem solving. Sometimes it's the difference between survival and extinction. Threx waved a hand dismissively, unimpressed. Your species celebrates chaos, and yet you survive by chance, not by design. He turned his attention back to the simulator, watching Lily as she prepared for the next scenario. Her casual demeanor belied the complexity of the program before her. What difficulty setting is she using? Threx demanded. Ellison smirked. That last one was Advanced Fleet Master. He paused, and then added, but it's still a few steps below the highest levels. Threx's scales rippled slightly, a sign of his growing irritation. He stepped forward, towering over Lily's small form. You seem confident in your abilities, child, he said, his voice cold and measured. Lily glanced up at him without fear. Confidence isn't the word, she said casually. It's more like practice. She pointed at the screen as if offering a lesson. See, you just have to keep your fleets moving. If they stay still, they're sitting ducks. Threx's expression didn't change, but inwardly he bristled. This human child was lecturing him as seasoned Admiral of the 4th Corps Armada on fleet maneuvers. Then he saw the crowd beginning to part as one of the station's engineers approached carrying a datapad. The man whispered something to Ellison, who nodded and turned to Threx. Admiral, it seems we have a unique opportunity here. Lily's next scenario is part of the Nightmare Protocol. Threx tilted his head at the unfamiliar term. Explain. Ellison grinned. It's the highest difficulty setting in Stellar Fleet Academy, designed to replicate the chaos of interstellar war at its most complex, adaptive AI randomized events, and almost no margin for error. Even most adults can't finish it. The murmurs in the room grew quieter as Lily adjusted the settings on the simulator. Her face was no longer playful but focused as she worked through the preparation screens. Finally, she turned to the crowd with a grin, ready to see something cool. Before Threx could object, the simulation began, and the displays filled with the shimmering light of Starfield ships and battle formations. The AI wasted no time overwhelming Lily's fleet with an ambush, forcing her into immediate defensive maneuvers. Threx's upper pair of eyes scanned the display while his lower pair focused on Lily's hands moving deftly over the controls. She split her forces faster than before, creating decoys to lure enemy ships into crossfire positions. The child is too bold, Threx muttered to Ellison. She sacrifices too many resources too quickly. Ellison chuckled. Low-risk moves don't win high-stakes battles, Admiral. Sometimes you have to spend big to win big. Threx's rebuttal died on his lips as Lily executed a flawless bait-and-switch maneuver, her flagship leading an enemy dreadnought into an asteroid field, where her hidden units awaited. The enemy ship was destroyed in seconds. The simulation escalated as more enemy forces warped in, but Lily remained calm. Her decisions came faster and faster as the simulation's chaos reached its peak. She made mistakes, but compensated for them with rapid adjustments. Threx found himself leaning forward, his analytical mind working to keep pace with hers. He hated to admit it, but he was impressed. As the scenario reached its climax, Lily's flagship launched a daring final assault on the enemy command ship. Her fleet barely survived the counterattack, but the mission objective was completed. The screen flashed with the words "Mission accomplished." The room erupted into cheers, but Threx remained silent this time. However, his silence was not born of disdain, but of something he hadn't felt in centuries: true intrigue. The cheers and applause echoed around the room as Lily leaned back in her chair, a triumphant grin on her face. Her friends gathered closer, patting her on the back and shouting excitedly about how incredible her performance had been. Admiral Threx, however, remained perfectly still. His 4 eyes stayed fixed on the simulator screen, which now displayed the detailed statistics of Lily's victory. The room was filled with noise, but to Threx it felt muted. He was focused entirely on the data displayed before him. Each movement, each decision, each command was recorded in excruciating detail. It was a record not of randomness, but of precision, albeit an unconventional form. Captain Ellison stepped closer to Threx, folding his arms casually behind his back. "Well, Admiral, what do you think?" he asked with a knowing smile. Threx did not respond immediately. Instead, his lower eyes studied Lily, who was now stretching her arms and chatting with her friends, as if what she had just accomplished was trivial. He spoke finally, his tone as cold and measured as ever. "What is the true purpose of this program?" Ellison's smirk widened. "I was wondering when you'd ask that, Admiral." He gestured to the simulator and the other similar setups scattered throughout the recreational area. "This isn't just a game, Threx. This is Stellar Fleet Academy. It's part of a system we've implemented to train and evaluate potential commanders." Threx tilted his head slightly, evaluating Ellison's words. "Explain." "It's pretty simple, really," Ellison continued. "The simulator uses adaptive AI to create challenges that mirror real interstellar combat scenarios. It's designed to teach players the principles of strategy, resource management, and quick decision-making in chaotic environments. He paused, glancing back at Lily. And some people like her have a knack for it. Threx's scales rippled faintly, indicating his deepening irritation. So this is not play but preparation, he said, his voice sharp. Ellison shrugged. A little of both. We humans like to mix fun with learning. Keeps people engaged, keeps them thinking. Threx turned his attention back to Lily, who was now spinning lazily in her chair. So this human child is being trained to command fleets. Lily overheard and stopped spinning, turning her chair to face Threx with an amused expression. Nah, I just like blowing up bad guys. The room filled with laughter at her comment, but Threx was unmoved. He stepped closer, towering over her with his imposing frame. Do you understand the consequences of your actions, child? The cost of every life aboard those ships you so carelessly sacrifice. Lily's smile faded slightly, but she met his gaze with surprising steadiness. I do, she said firmly, but that's what the simulator is for, to make mistakes and learn from them. She glanced back at the screens. It's not like the stakes are real here. Threx's gaze didn't waver. The stakes are always real, he said gravely. Every simulation, every decision, teaches you something that may determine whether your species thrives or perishes. Lily frowned, studying him carefully before responding. Sounds like someone needs a turn, she said, grinning again. How about you give it a shot, Mr. Alien? Ellison burst out laughing as the crowd erupted into cheers and chants, urging the Admiral to try the simulator himself. Threx's scales darkened slightly at the noise, but he remained calm, turning his gaze to Ellison. Is this your idea of diplomacy, Captain? Ellison raised his hands defensively. Hey, it's not my idea, Admiral, it's theirs. He nodded toward the gathered children and adults who were now fully invested in seeing the Vorth Corps commander test his mettle. Threx's gaze swept across the room before settling on Lily, whose grin had returned to full strength. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she gestured toward the chair. Come on, I'll even set it to something easy for you. Threx bristled at the implication. Easy. The crowd laughed again, but this time it didn't bother him as much as he thought it might. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, towering over the simulator chair. You may adjust the settings to the highest level, he said calmly. If I am to evaluate your so-called preparation, I will do so properly. The room went silent as Lily's grin widened even further. You asked for it, she said cheerfully as she began inputting commands to configure the simulation for the Nightmare Protocol. As Threx lowered himself into the chair and placed his hands on the unfamiliar controls, the crowd held its collective breath. The scenario loaded, and the displays filled with the familiar chaos of Starship warfare. Threx's trial had begun. The room had gone utterly silent as Admiral Threx settled into the simulator chair. The imposing Vorth Corps' movements were deliberate and measured as his clawed hands hovered over the controls. For all his disdain for humanity's methods, there was a spark of curiosity in his lower eyes as he examined the complex interface. Lily leaned against the edge of the console, watching with a mischievous grin. She had set the simulator to Nightmare Protocol, the most difficult and unforgiving setting in Stellar Fleet Academy. She wasn't sure if the alien Admiral could handle it, but she couldn't wait to see him try. Captain Ellison stood nearby, arms crossed and a look of quiet amusement on his face. He addressed Threx with an even tone. The simulator is adaptive, Admiral. It will respond to your strategies and adjust accordingly. Just remember, speed and precision are key. Threx did not respond. Instead, his focus was absolute. As the simulation began, the screens came alive with Starfield's enemy vessels and a tactical map displaying his fleet configuration. A computerized voice echoed through the speakers. Fleet detected, enemy engagement imminent. Threx wasted no time. His clawed fingers flew over the controls, adjusting formations and deploying scout ships to assess the enemy positions. His fleet moved with a fluidity that surprised the human spectators. Despite the alien interface, Threx adapted to it quickly as though it were second nature. The first wave of enemy ships warped in surrounding his fleet in a classic pincer maneuver. The crowd watched intently as Threx countered with ruthless efficiency. His scouts identified the weakest link in the enemy formation, and he exploited it, sending a concentrated strike force to shatter their flank. Lily raised her eyebrows, impressed. "The guy's not bad," she muttered, earning a chuckle from Ellison. But the simulation was only beginning. As Threx's fleet pushed through the first wave, a second larger force appeared from hyperspace. The AI was relentless, overwhelming his fleet with sheer numbers and forcing him into defensive maneuvers. Threx's upper eyes tracked the main fleet, while his lower eyes focused on the secondary tactical map. He issued commands with the precision of a battle-hardened general, splitting his forces into smaller units to counter multiple threats at once. He used asteroid fields and nebulae to mask his movements, drawing the enemy into traps. The crowd gasped as his flagship barely avoided destruction, maneuvering through a minefield to evade pursuing dreadnoughts. Yet Threx showed no signs of panic. His movements were controlled, his decisions calculated. Then the simulation escalated once more. Enemy reinforcements arrived, accompanied by a supercarrier bristling with firepower. Threx's fleet was outnumbered and outgunned, yet he pressed on, deploying every ounce of his strategic acumen to outmaneuver the overwhelming forces. Lily leaned closer, her grin fading as she watched in awe. The Admiral's tactics were unlike anything she'd seen before, bold, but never reckless, creative yet grounded in logic. He was turning the tide of the battle against impossible odds. But even Threx was not invincible. A miscalculation allowed the enemy to flank his support vessels, leaving his flagship exposed. The crowd collectively held its breath as the enemy supercarrier launched a devastating barrage of missiles. Threx's upper eyes narrowed while his lower eyes darted across the displays. He made a desperate decision, ordering his remaining forces into a high-risk formation designed to break through the enemy lines. It was a gambit, one that carried the possibility of total annihilation. As his fleet executed the maneuver, the enemy supercarrier turned its attention to intercept them. Threx used this distraction to launch a surprise strike from a hidden squadron of fighters, which tore through the carrier's defenses. The simulation ended abruptly with the words "Mission accomplished" flashing across the screen. The room erupted into cheers and applause, but Threx remained motionless, his clawed hands still resting on the controls. Slowly he rose from the chair, towering over the crowd. His expression was unreadable. Lily stepped forward, her grin returning as she looked up at him. "Not bad for a first-timer," she said. Threx glanced down at her, his lower eyes narrowing in thought. "Perhaps there is more to your species than chaos and chance after all," he said. The energy in the room was electric as Admiral Threx stepped away from the simulator. Every eye was on him, including Lily's, which gleamed with a mixture of amusement and admiration. For the first time in centuries, the seasoned Vorthquar tactician felt something he rarely experienced outside a real battlefield: exhilaration. Captain Ellison clapped a hand on Threx's arm, his grin as wide as ever. "Well, Admiral, I think you just earned yourself a spot on the Stellar Fleet leaderboards," he said with a chuckle. Threx gave him a withering look, though the edges of his scaled face softened, as though he was reluctantly humoring the human. "Your so-called game is flawed," he said, his tone sharp, but his lower eyes flickered toward Lily, revealing his continued intrigue. "It rewards reckless maneuvers and places undue emphasis on unpredictability rather than discipline." Lily crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Is that why you won then?" she shot back, earning a ripple of laughter from the crowd. Threx's upper eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond to her provocation. Instead, he turned to Captain Ellison, addressing him with measured words. "Your training system has merit, albeit buried beneath layers of human frivolity. The adaptability of the AI, the complexity of the scenarios these elements mirrored, the chaotic realities of interstellar warfare." Ellison nodded. "That's exactly the point, Admiral. Chaos isn't something you can avoid, it's something you have to learn to navigate, especially when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and up against enemies who don't play by the rules." Threx's scales shimmered faintly as he considered this. The human approach to strategy was undoubtedly different from the rigid doctrines of the Vorthquar Armada, where every move was calculated to perfection. Yet there was an undeniable effectiveness to their methods, even if it bordered on madness. Before Threx could respond, Lily stepped forward, her grin wide, and her voice cutting through the tense air. "So, Mr. Alien, do you still think we're just kids playing games, or did I teach you a thing or two?" The Admiral regarded her with a mixture of exasperation and amusement, though his face remained unreadable. "Your confidence borders on arrogance, child," he said, "yet your instincts are commendable for one so inexperienced." Lily's grin widened as she leaned against the simulator console. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said cheerfully. The crowd laughed again, and Ellison took the opportunity to steer the conversation back to diplomacy. "Admiral," he said, his tone now serious, "this simulation is more than a tool for training. It's also a way for us to learn from others. We've shared it with many allied species, and even they admit it's helped improve their strategic thinking." Threx raised a clawed hand, silencing Ellison. "I understand its value," he said curtly, though his gaze remained fixed on the simulator. "Yet I question whether your young should be exposed to such systems. Their recklessness could become a liability rather than an asset." Lily tilted her head, studying him thoughtfully. "Reckless, Hut," she said. "Well, maybe, but sometimes taking risks is the only way to win. When the odds are stacked against you, playing it safe isn't an option." Her words lingered in the air, drawing a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Threx's lower eyes flickered briefly toward her, his expression unreadable. Perhaps there was wisdom in her recklessness after all. Before he could speak, an alert sounded through the room. The station's intercom crackled to life. "Security to command deck. All personnel report immediately." The jovial atmosphere evaporated as the crowd quieted. Threx turned sharply to Ellison, whose expression had gone serious. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Ellison tapped his communicator. "This is Ellison Command Deck Report." A tense voice responded. "Unknown vessels approaching the station. They're not responding to hails, and they're heavily armed." Threx's posture straightened, his scales shimmering with a faint glow of readiness. "Captain," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "I suggest you prepare your forces." Lily looked between them, her grin fading as the weight of the situation settled in her chest. For the first time, she saw the faintest glimmer of uncertainty in the eyes of the adults around her. The simulation was over, but the real battle was about to begin. The air in the room grew tense as the announcement echoed through the station's security to command deck. "All personnel report immediately." The playful energy that had dominated moments earlier was replaced with an undercurrent of dread. Lily looked around at the adults, their faces grim as they processed the situation. Admiral Threx's upper eyes narrowed, his lower ones focused on Captain Ellison, whose hand was still on his communicator. "You must provide me with details immediately," he said, his voice a low growl. "What vessels are these, and what is their purpose?" Ellison responded without hesitation. "Unknown class. They're not broadcasting any identifiers, and they've powered up their weapons." Threx's scales rippled faintly with irritation. As he straightened to his full imposing height, he turned to Lily, who had instinctively stepped closer to the simulator and was now watching the exchange with wide eyes. "You humans have a habit of stumbling into chaos," he muttered. Lily frowned, crossing her arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" she shot back. Ellison cut through the tension with a sharp gesture. "Enough, both of you. This is serious." He turned to the children gathered around. "All right, everyone back to your quarters now. This isn't a drill." Lily hesitated, glancing at the simulator, and then at Threx. Something inside her itched at the idea of leaving. She didn't like running away when there was something she could do. Before anyone could stop her, she blurted out, "What if we use the simulator? It's not just for training, right? It can connect to real fleets." Ellison looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Lily, this isn't a game." But Lily stepped closer, pointing at the console. "It's not about playing. I mean, you've got an actual admiral here, and he's really good at this stuff. Why not let him help?" The room went silent as all eyes turned to Threx. He studied Lily for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. The idea of involving a child in a real combat scenario would have been laughable if not for her uncanny instincts displayed earlier. He looked at Ellison, his voice calm but commanding. "Can this system interface with your station's tactical network?" Ellison hesitated, then nodded. "It can, but Admiral, this is highly irregular." Threx's scales shimmered faintly as he turned back to the simulator. I am not interested in what is regular, Captain. If these vessels are hostile, your station is woefully unprepared to face them. He placed his clawed hands on the controls, activating the system's real-time integration. Then let us see if this human ingenuity can truly match the chaos it so eagerly embraces. Lily's grin returned faintly as she leaned against the console watching Threx work. He moved quickly, configuring the simulator for live fleet command. His calm precision was mesmerizing, and for a moment she forgot the danger looming outside. Ellison barked orders into his communicator, directing the station's security forces to prepare for potential boarding. Meanwhile, Threx pulled up the tactical data streams, analyzing the enemy fleet's formation. The hostile ships were closing in, a mix of heavy cruisers and smaller escort vessels. Their lack of communication suggested one thing: they were here to fight. The simulation displays lit up with real-time tactical maps and fleet data. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only Ellison, Lily, and a handful of engineers who worked frantically to support Threx. Threx issued his first command with cold efficiency: deploy decoy drones along their projected path, force them to split their formation. Ellison nodded approvingly at the tactic, though his face remained tense. The station's defenses were strong, but not invincible. They needed every advantage. Lily watched intently, her heart pounding as the simulation transformed into reality. She wanted to speak, to offer suggestions, but for once she stayed quiet, trusting the Admiral's expertise. The enemy fleet began reacting to the decoys, splitting their forces, just as Threx had predicted. He wasted no time exploiting the opening, directing the station's defense cannons to concentrate fire on the weakened flank. Explosions rippled through the void as the first wave of enemy ships crumbled. Threx's tactics were ruthless, efficient, and relentless, yet the enemy continued to press forward. Their largest vessel, a hulking dreadnought, loomed ominously in the distance. Threx's lower eyes flickered toward Lily briefly. You suggested this system was effective, child, he said, his voice cold. If you are correct, then victory may still be possible. Lily nodded, her confidence growing alongside her adrenaline. Let's make it count, she said. The room braced itself as the final phase of the battle began. The battle had reached its crescendo. The tactical displays filled with the chaos of flashing weapon fire, swirling debris, and countless blips marking the movements of friendly and hostile forces. Admiral Threx's clawed hands danced over the controls as he directed the station's defensive systems and coordinated its remaining fleet. Lily stood at his side, her fists clenched as she watched the battle unfold. Her usual grin was gone, replaced with a look of intense focus. The looming dreadnought on the screen dominated her attention, its massive bulk shrugging off attack after attack. Captain Ellison paced behind them, barking updates into his communicator. Enemy forces are focusing fire on our outer hull shields, are down to 40%, reinforced sectors 9 through 12 now. Threx's voice cut through the noise with unyielding calm. Focus fire on their escort vessels. First, their mobility is their strength. Remove it, and they will falter. The station's cannons pivoted, firing in unison at the smaller ships that flitted around the dreadnought. One by one, they exploded into brilliant bursts of light, leaving the massive flagship vulnerable. The room cheered briefly at the success, but the relief was short-lived. The dreadnought's main cannons charged, their energy readings spiking on the tactical display. A single shot from those cannons could cripple the station. Lily leaned closer to the simulator, her voice urgent. What about the drones? We could use them to distract it like before. Threx glanced at her, his lower eyes narrowing slightly. You suggest sending decoys to draw their fire, he said, a trace of skepticism in his tone. She nodded quickly. Yeah, but not just as a distraction. They've got energy shields, right? We could overload their systems by detonating them near the dreadnought's hull. Threx paused for a fraction of a second, considering her words before nodding. Acceptable. Deploy the drones in a staggered pattern around the dreadnought's core. Focus the detonation sequence on its propulsion system. The engineers nearby scrambled to execute the command. The drones launched from the station's bays, racing toward the massive ship like a swarm of fireflies. The room watched in tense silence as the small machines weaved through enemy fire, some of them exploding prematurely, others pressing forward. The first wave of drones reached their target. Their detonations were small against the colossal hull of the dreadnought, but they began to have an effect. The enemy ship's shields flickered briefly, then failed, leaving its vulnerable core exposed. Threx wasted no time directing the station's remaining fleet to focus fire on the exposed sections of the dreadnought. Missiles streaked through the void, impacting with devastating precision. The massive ship groaned under the strain, its once imposing presence now listing as explosions tore through its superstructure. The enemy fleet began to scatter, their remaining ships retreating into hyperspace as their flagship erupted into a blinding inferno of light and debris. The room erupted into cheers as the words "Mission Accomplished" flashed across the display. Threx stepped back from the simulator, his towering frame as composed as ever, though his scales shimmered faintly, betraying his satisfaction. "This station survives another day," he said, his voice calm though tinged with a rare note of respect. Ellison clapped him on the back. "A lot of that's thanks to you, Admiral. You might just have a knack for human-style chaos after all." Lily grinned up at Threx, her earlier confidence returning. "Told you this wasn't just a game," she said. Threx looked down at her, his lower eyes studying her with newfound curiosity. "You possess an unrefined yet promising strategic mind, child," he said, though his tone was less harsh than before. "Perhaps your recklessness is not entirely without merit." Lily beamed at the backhanded compliment. "You're not so bad yourself, Mr. Alien," she said. The tension in the room finally began to lift, replaced with laughter and relief, as the crew celebrated their unlikely victory. But for Threx, the battle had sparked a deeper realization. Humanity's chaotic, unpredictable nature was not a weakness, it was their greatest strength. And he would ensure that the Vorthquar Armada learned from it.